So what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially the science, the neuroscience, and the psychology behind how we learn. So a lot of the information we're presenting today comes from a series of professional development workshops I've done probably over the last 5 or 6 years. And especially recently I've been working with the Learning in the Brain Institute in several of their seminars and conference workshops for teachers. And today specifically, I have a couple of resources that I used. So there's a paper by Stephen Chu, professor at Stanford, not Stanford, but Stanford University, associated with Howard College. And he has done a lot of work on what we consider cognitive challenges associated with teaching and how you set teaching pedagogy to deal with cognitive challenges. But then there's also 3 books that I actually also highly recommend. Arba Oakley is an engineering professor at Oakland University, but she has done a phenomenal job of actually understanding and looking into schema theory and how we develop long-term memory and how that works with students. And so she's written 2 books, A Mind for Numbers, and how you can basically use study strategies you can use as a student. And this is actually written for parents, high school students, college students. And then her other book, Learning How to Learn, is pretty much the same information, but written for more middle school age. So this is a great book for middle school kids. And then Daniel Williamham, he's at James Madison University, and he's written several books on learning, teaching. One of his books that's phenomenal is on how to get kids to read, especially in the digital age. But his book here, Outsmart Your Brain, is his newest book, and it has a lot of study strategies and techniques in it. So this one has some very practical advice. For instance, what do you do if you fail an exam? What do you do if you seem to have troubles with communicating to your teacher? So his book has like very specific strategies based on troubleshooting principles. So most of the information I talk about comes from these 4 resources. So what I'm hopefully going to try to get through today are 3 major things. First of all, just understanding what we mean by cognitive challenges to learning and how our mindset and how actually just the biology and chemistry of our brain works. The memory cycle and how we learn, so more into how we actually encode information, store information, retrieve it, and something called schema theory. And then what I like to get into is effective study strategies, basically what works and what doesn't. So hopefully we can get through all those 3 things today. There's going to be a little bit more audience participation in that. All right, so, that's the scratch paper. So to be an effective teacher, to be what they call like a master teacher, does take quite a few years to do, because one of the things you need is knowledge in your field, right? Like probably qualifications to teach biology and chemistry. Not be able to do Latin. But the other thing you really need to do to be an effective teacher is a knowledge of how students learn in your area. So what topics do my students struggle with the most? Where is something that I need to slow down the pace? Where is something where I need to interject an activity, a discussion? Where are those sticky points that tend to always give problems? What units, what concepts? Those types of things. So I need to know that. But the other thing you need to know is a knowledge of how students learn. Essentially, that's what we call cognitive psychology. How our brains actually can form information. And if you are great at all of those kinds of things, that's where the effective teaching comes in. Because the teaching is not a transfer of knowledge as I speak and it dumps into their brain. Teaching is being able to set up an environment where every student has potential for success. Mr. Akavan always likes to say, our effort and our value as a teacher is not judged in the kids who really don't need us, because there are kids out there who I could have a cutout and they would be just fine. They know how to learn. They are amazing. It's for all the other kids, right? That's where our job lies. But the problem is, learning occurs in only one location, that's inside the brain of the student. So as much as I would love to have like scanners and I could see in real time what they're thinking, what they're doing, it's not possible. So that learning is going to happen there. And so that means it's a huge onus on them and an active learner to do that. So what we have to do with both teaching and learning, so from the student's standpoint and the teaching standpoint, is that we have to mesh our strategies with the strengths and weaknesses of just how our mind works. I don't think a lot of students understand that. I even meet a lot of teachers who don't necessarily understand it, because it's amazing how much stuff isn't always communicated, especially in cognitive psychology, with teacher certification programs. Yeah, there's still a lot of work to get through that. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about the cognitive challenges to learning. More of this is just for any teachers in the room in the beginning to try to look at. So a cognitive challenge is a characteristic or aspect of mental processing that can affect the success or failure of learning. So it could be something that actually helps, but it could also be a mental process that hurts. Okay. So Chu and Corbin have a paper out from 2020 in which they identified essentially 9 cognitive challenges of teaching. And they sort of broke them up into 4 categories. And this is what I like about this model is it serves as a diagnostic tool for teachers. Instead of being told, do jigsaw activities, do prezzies, this is actually a diagnostic you can do of what's going on in my class. Am I working to design pedagogy to deal with all of these different types of cognitive challenges? And if I do have a struggle with a student, which cognitive challenge am I addressing? It could be multiple. And so it's a diagnostic. So it's a better way of trying to approach your design. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, because this would be more for actually geared for teachers. But I do feel that you have to have a little bit of background information to understand how the brain works by looking at these. So we will talk a little bit about working memory and the constraints of working memory and how it can affect learning. There's random, I don't know what the random beats are for. There's also issues with understanding prior knowledge about your students and what they already know coming into a class and what they don't know. But also, what are some effective strategies and how that works? So we're going to kind of focus on those. But there's obviously lots of other types of challenges teachers are going to face, just like the mental mindset of the student. They come in already feeling like they hate math. That's going to be a problem, right? If they don't have a trust in the teacher, if they don't feel like they belong in the community, that's a problem. So there's a lot of things about that. But one of the things we're going to really talk about here is metacognition, self-regulation. So students, metacognition is knowing what you know. How do I know what I know? And as humans, we're terrible at it. It is, and you have to develop it. And then self-regulation is not like, being able to not throw something at your friend or your sister, but it's recognizing the behaviors you're doing are not helping and what to do to change it. So recognizing your study strategies aren't working. You need to do that. And that comes with maturity and development. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes skipping grades is not always the best thing, because this process takes much longer to develop than you might if you try to jump ahead. All right, so as a teacher, all those 9 concepts you have to deal with simultaneously. So in reality, you think about them as single, or like practice and theory, it's like single things, but this is what happens when you're in the classroom. They work, it's all together. And so when I get home, my husband says, what do you want for dinner? And I say, I have no clue. It's because I made 1,000,001 decisions already. This is what my day looks like. It's constant changing and planning. Even the same course, honors bio, morning and an afternoon can be completely different. I have to switch things even within the class, because each class is its own persona, so you have to deal with it all. All right, so the science of memory and how we learn. So I'll kind of give you sort of a neuroscience perspective of it a little bit. So when we talk about learning, there's many different definitions of learning. A lot of times students consider learning as, I got a great grade, it's a high score on my test, yay, right? But learning is actually more than that. Effective learning, and I think the value in the kind of score that we should be using for evaluating learning is whether you're acquiring knowledge so that you can make sense of future problems, okay? A process that leads to change that increases the potential of improved performance in future learning. What we're talking about is transfer. What we're talking about is being able to take something that you've learned in the classroom and transfer it to another class, which is called near transfer, and then far transfer is, can you still use it and apply that information a couple years years from now, essentially, right? And you'd be amazed at how many students will learn one thing in one class, come into my class, and might learn something different. Instead of questioning it, they just figure, well, in physics, things just must work this way, and in biology, things work this way. Well, no. Somewhere, maybe there's just a disconnect. Or they're in math, and they learn standard deviation, or how to use fractions, and they come into biology, and they have to do a fraction, and they're like, how do you do that? I'm like, well, just because you changed rooms doesn't mean yeah. So transfer is what we're trying to get at when we look at learning. That's like the technical term for learning. All right, so to learn, what we want to do is get things into our long-term memory, right? But one thing you have to keep in mind is nothing gets into long-term memory without first going through our working memory. So in our prefrontal lobes, basically where working memory is operating. And that long-term memory is throughout our cerebral cortex, moving through essentially the hippocampus. So we need to go through this process. That's kind of like the simple pared down schema for how we learn. And so I need to define working memory because it becomes a little bit important later. So your working memory is just a short-term memory system that selects, holds, reorganizes, and combines information. So think of it as like a virtual whiteboard. You have this magnetic board that has a bunch of little word pieces on. You ever see that where people can make like a poem from all these like words? So you have this like virtual whiteboard in your brain, and it can only hold so much information. It's trying to select those pieces. It's trying to reorganize and make sense of them so that it can be transferred to long-term memory. Okay, so your working memory is literally just this chalkboard or dry erase board that you're working with temporarily to help. So there's a few essential caveats or things that we need to talk about with working memory. So first of all, working memory is crucial for learning. So nothing gets into your long-term memory without going through working memory first. It has to go through that whole shuffling around in the chalkboard kind of thing. Your working memory capacity is limited. So there's an octopus here with only 4 arms, not 8, because working memory on average can only hold 4 to 6 pieces of information at a time. Okay? So it doesn't hold too much stuff at one time. The more you're requiring working memory to work, the more mental load you have, and your whole system can shut down. So you can think of like a generator being pulled too much wattage trying to go through there, and it overloads our circuit breaker. So you have to be really careful that you always, as a teacher, understand the working memory capacity and the cognitive load of your students, because if you step over that, that's the danger zone. Things can happen. So our working memory capacity develops naturally, but cannot otherwise be enhanced. So it does increase a little bit as you mature, okay? But the average person is somewhere 4 to 6. You can't make working memory better. So there's a lot of programs out there, these neuropsychology apps that claim they can increase your working memory and all of that kind of stuff, and there isn't any evidence that that actually works. Working memory seems to be sort of a fixed principle for humans, so somewhere between 4 to 6 units. So there are some people who have 4-armed octopuses up here in their octopi, up in their brain, and some that only have 6 arms in there. But one of the things about working memory is that if you have a very well-organized facts or procedures in your long-term memory, so if you have a lot of things that are stored and organized very well, so that those principles are automatic, that counts as like a single unit. So you can, so I think this is where people think you can increase your working memory capacity. You really can't, but what can happen is if you have things stored in long-term memory so that they're automatic, then that huge schema of information can serve as just like a single unit.
So like math facts.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's how we make complex learning possible, is by getting things in long-term memory, and then they start to build into units, and those units each contain larger pieces of information. All right, so when you talk about our brain, you can't help not talk about neurons. So neurons are going to send signals, all right? And so we have all these fun little interneurons in our brain, and at the end of our neurons, we have these little knobs called dendritic spines. So the signal strength and the connections between neurons are reflected in essentially the density of these spines. So when you're learning something, what you're doing is you're creating links between these neurons. You're not creating new neurons. What you're doing is increasing the number of links between pre-existing neurons. Right? And those connections are going to strengthen with practice. So practice is the key to helping cement this in. So as you can see, the density of dendritic spines actually increases with practice. If you don't practice, those synaptic or dendritic spines get taken away. So use it or lose it. All right. So we can represent these links with nodes and lines, and that's what sort of we're trying to do when I introduce some of the next few slides, is we can kind of use this nodes and lines to represent these connections. Oops, went too far. And so then these connections become what we call schema. So schema is how you're organizing information in long-term memory, essentially. So schema is the term that cognitive psychologists use, is that it's a mental model of an object or event that includes knowledge as well as beliefs and expectations. Okay, so it's this mental map you produce within your brain about some situation, how to do 2 plus 6 is 8, understanding what happened at Thanksgiving and remembering all the events at Thanksgiving. So our long-term memory is essentially organized into these different schema. So schema then help you consolidate information, and our transfer of knowledge, in other words, being able to learn something here and apply it there, it comes from integrating overlapping schema. So we're going to do that. And a really good schema serves as the equivalent of a bigger working memory capacity. So the more organized and cemented these schema are, you actually now see things as a whole rather than individual parts. Okay. So that can actually help. So I'll give you guys give an example. I'm going to go to something that I know nothing about, which is literature. So we'll do that. So as I said, a schema is a mental model of an object or event that includes knowledge as well as beliefs and expectations. So let's say you're in your literature class and they start discussing the Renaissance movement. Okay. So as you're learning about it, you start to build these little connections, and now you have, right now, your literature schema consists of all of this information about the Renaissance. Okay, the Renaissance writers and Renaissance movement. Okay. So now what you start to do as you move into the next unit, you start learning about the Romantics. Then you start learning about realism. So, I don't know if this has a little pointer on it, but I don't know if you can see how there are going to be some aspects of what you learned about in Renaissance, in the Renaissance schema, that are going to sort of overlap with the Romantics. There's going to be something that is going to be overlapping with realism. Okay? So we've got a little overlap, here's some more. So what happens is we start integrating these individual bits into something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So now this is our fully formed literature schema. So these have all combined to produce one larger working model. Okay. So our transfer of knowledge comes from integrating these overlapping bits and pieces and practicing with overlapping these bits and pieces as we study. So if you move on to second semester literature course, and now you start doing the transcendentalists. I had to have my daughter help me.
Good look that up.
I was trying to do something with math, but it just didn't seem to work as nice. Then suddenly you start pulling back to your previous literature schema, and you're like, oh, this piece can now fit in, right? And you get this improved literature schema. Now you learn on modernism, that piece fits in. But what's really great is when you have a good schema, you can consolidate this information, and now essentially this whole literature schema is like a single unit to you. So your working memory capacity is sort of, I guess you're compensating for that limitations that we have of 4 to 6 by being able to pull this whole thing as one unit of working memory when you need to add to it. Okay. The other thing is that learning becomes easier as your schema expands. So as you build schema and you learn, learning actually becomes easier. So that learning curve, right? Everything's so hard at the beginning, and then suddenly things take off. So by having these really good schemas, you can actually build to them a lot easier than you would otherwise. So that's very important concept. All right. So that kind of explains the difference between somebody who's a novice and an expert. So a novice, like chess player, my husband plays chess. He won first place in his chess tournament on Saturday, so he won't let me forget that. I'm terrible at chess. A novice chess player sees a single move at a time. So they're just looking at everything in their working memory as one piece here, one piece there. Right? But the expert chess player sees sets as moves as one schema. So they can see further into the head of the moves, see the board. It's like Gestalt theory. Basically, the idea is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So the expert can actually see sets of moves as schema. So they can anticipate, they can actually relive an entire chess game in their head because they actually have things set up as working memory bits, as huge schema that all work together. So this is why prior knowledge is very critical, and knowing what your students' prior knowledge is very critical. Because basically what prior knowledge is doing is that's the foothold. The new knowledge that you're trying to give to your students is the handhold. So we can really only build on a foundation we have. Without that prior knowledge, it becomes very difficult to reach to new knowledge. And it can be very difficult to work in the classroom as a student sitting there if you don't have some prior knowledge already. Like if you're still struggling with the concept of what 8 means, or 2 plus 6 is 8, you're spending all your cognitive energy trying to remember, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they're already moving ahead, right? So that prior knowledge. So the reason why prior knowledge is very helpful and a really good schemas are helpful is this is a way to even out the students who maybe have lesser working memory capacity than others. It's because of the size of working memory capacity doesn't matter if there's already a lot of links in the system. So this is why things like the math facts and the phonics rules are so important. Because if you're on an advanced math problem and you're still struggling with those concepts of, all right, I still got to use all this memory capacity to do 2 plus 6 is 8, but they're already moved further ahead in the class, it's going to be very, very difficult for you. The phonics rules. In fact, there's something called the Flynn effect. After the 1970s, IQ, math scores, etc., had kind of gone down. That's about when we stopped with the math facts and moved to the whole world gap. So there's a huge return. And this is why Kuhn math works so well. Kuhn math actually uses all these concepts to do that. All right, so prior knowledge is critical. What I'm just trying to get at with this slide is that a lot of the things when you're first learning it is deliberate. You're really using your memory, your working memory to work through things. So you're very conscious of it. You have to, it's slow to use because you really have to sort of spend time reliving it and pulling it back up and manipulating those types of things within your working memory. But if you get material, especially certain concepts and foundations, into your automatic processing, now it's very easy, fast to use, and it can help account for limitations of working memory. So think of like tying your shoes. Very difficult to do in your first day as a little kid. But now that tying your shoes is so automatic, it's almost hard to explain it to anybody, right? It's like, you don't have to think about it. So my mental cognitive load is not worrying about how am I going to, I just tie my shoe now, right? So I can tie my shoe while I'm answering somebody what 2 plus 6 is. So if you eliminate just pure rote learning, you kind of eliminate the easiest way to handle routine learning tasks. So there is still some rote learning we have to have. There is. And I have a lot of students who are like, oh, Dr. T, I just Google it. Like, I just look all this stuff up. Why do I have to remember the polyatomic ions? Well, because remember the polyatomic ions, and I say phosphate, because we're in this class discussion and we're working, you already know what that is. If you have to spend time remembering which one's the phosphate, you're overloading the system. And then I just tell them, this is not who I want you to be. You're not going to say, where's the frontal lobe, right? That's unacceptable. You need to know. So there are things you do need to know. And it's going to help you later. I know.
That's a great slide.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right.
hold on, can you go back? So everyone in my family needs to see that.
Yeah, it's I know it sucks to feel like you have to memorize, but there are some things you gotta learn. It's just fun. All right, So I'll kind of go through the memory cycle, how we actually move things from working memory, which is called encoding, into long-term memory, which is the storage, and then actually how we retrieve that information. And the reason why it's a cycle is that you have, in order to cement things into schema and to build schema, you have to constantly encode, store, retrieve, re-encode, store. So that's what we call deliberate practice. In psychology work here, deliberate practice is retrieving information, re-encoding it, putting it back into the system, and pulling it back out again, over and over and over again. So there's some basic, I tried to take as simple as I could, like just 3 things to take home points when you talk about learning. First of all, we remember what we encode. So nothing gets into long-term memory without working memory first. Too much, too fast, it won't last. That means why cramming doesn't work, okay? Or, yeah, cramming never works. And that's also why you can't do too much at once. Especially as a teacher, you gotta keep that in mind. We have to retrieve to remember, which means you have to go through that whole cycle over and over and over again. We call it deliberate practice. And then learning is hard and takes effort. That's the part that students don't necessarily like. But you have to have the deeper you're processing, the better you're learning, and time is not the same as effort. Right? I have to explain that to students a lot. How much time you spend on something does not equate to successful learning or transfer. So that's because what we tend to do is just fall into what's the easiest thing for us to do.
We read our notes.
We read our notes.
Yeah.
We highlight.
Yeah.
All right. So, got a little time to explain this crazy. This is the advanced version of the 3 circles. So, first of all, we remember what we encode. So we have all this stuff in our environment, and what we need to do is focus our attention on something. And we are only able to focus on basically one thing at a time. We can't multitask. And we encode it, which means we have to change it into a language that the system understands. So think of like a scanner. I have a photograph, an old-fashioned scanner, okay, not like these fancy things. I put it in there and I scan the photo to get into my computer, okay? So my encoding is only going to be as good as the resolution. In other words, how much I'm working with the material and how I'm getting into the system. So I'm going to encode it, I'm going to get it into the system, and I'm going to integrate that, hopefully, with some of my existing schema. So I have some existing schema, and I'm going to find some place to kind of attach it to, and that's going to help me build a slightly larger schema. Now, so I'm going to do that. And remember, working memory, selecting, holding, organizing, what that basically means is trying to figure out how it's going to get into my existing schema. But we also have to retrieve to remember. Okay? That means deliberately practicing. We have to deliberately recall and retrieve. Because if we just kind of forget about it and don't worry about practicing, it just goes away. Those little synaptic janitors go along and they trim our dendritic spines. But if we work with that information, pull it back into our working memory, what we do now is we re-encode it and put it back. So we're constantly revising our schema. We're building our schema, working with it. We're strengthening those points within that schema. So we do have to keep working with that. And that's what we call deliberate practice. Purposely recalling it and finding new ways each time to re-encode it and bring it back in. So you're basically trying to do things. Alright, and then learning is hard and takes effort. So we'll kind of get into that near the end when we talk about study strategies and techniques. Alright, so how to study efficiently. Well, that's a whole other. I know, and this is not like a prescription, it's just how to approach it. When you want to actually think about specific techniques, because they're all going to be different for each kid, that's where like Willingham and some of them have some really good strategies, and like I can talk to you guys about some stuff, but I'm just going to kind of give you like methods or practices and principles, and we can talk about more details, but how to study efficiently. Alright. First, the importance of undivided attention. I feel I have to bring this up because as a teacher and a mom, I have 2 kids. There is no evidence that multitasking is as effective as concentrating on one task at a time. Even small distractions significantly reduce our learning, even resisting the temptation of a distraction is a distraction. And there's no such thing as a momentary distraction. Okay, there really isn't. So, having the radio on, the TV on, when you're sitting. All right, so we're going to go through this distractions from the environment. So Duckworth, I don't know if she's the woman who wrote Grit. Yeah. She has a study or a thing. This is from her work. Basically, it's like a distraction cycle. I guess I don't know what else to call it. But I think this works really good if you explain this to students. I find that when you sit down and explain it to them, they're like, oh, yeah, okay. So let's say you're at this situation. You have your student is working. Their phone is sitting next to them, like mine is here. That's their situation, right? They're kind of focused. They're in there. Their phone beeps, and they get to shift their attention to the phone because they get a notification from their friend. Okay. So that's their attention is now brought away from what they're working on. So now there's the appraisal step. I have to decide what this means to me. How salient is it? Okay? Now, I'm pretty good at not, if somebody distracts me, I look at my phone, I'm pretty good at turning it off. But your kid remembers he's got a snap streak going. If he doesn't keep the snap streak going, he's gonna lose, I don't know what it is. I don't know anything about this stuff. It's horrible. So they gotta worry about that. So now it's, do I do this homework or do I respond? Oh, it's okay, I'm just gonna respond. I'm gonna keep it going. So they decide to respond. They get on Snap and then, rabbit hole. So, right. So now they have to redirect their attention, get back focused, etc.
Look at all the cameras.
That's gonna be a dinner conversation.
And as you move through the circle, inhibiting response gets harder and harder and harder. Okay. All right. So this is from Common Sense Media. They had a report that was just published in 2003. I think they're from the University of Michigan or Michigan State. I always get those two confused. Sorry, people's from Michigan. But this is essentially times a day and the average number of smartphone notifications kids get by age group. Okay. So look at where their premium study times is. All right, look at that. How many snaps they get. Obviously, there's some variation with them. This is basically like a boxing whisk response. The average kid gets 237 notifications a day. 237. Now, yeah, it's crazy, right? And I hear it. They're not supposed to have smartphones in our classes, but yet they put them in their backpacks, and it's ding, ding, ding. Yeah. All right. So here's the way to avoid distractions. So select your place. I know kids hate it, but I tell them, go to the library. Well, Brookfield Library or a library, someplace like that, right? Go someplace that doesn't have Wi-Fi unless you absolutely need it for your homework. And I'm going to tell you, my students don't need Wi-Fi for their homework. It's everything's in their textbook. Remove the distraction from your environment. Don't just say, turn it off or whatever. No, remove it from your environment. No TV. And there's even some research that says music is not good. There's a lot of different about it. Take the phone away, put it somewhere else. Because students overestimate the ability of their own willpower, and they underestimate the distractions that impact their learning, okay? So when you go through that whole distraction cycle, even when they pull that distraction away, that momentary, oh, look at my phone, it actually takes you 4 to 5 minutes to redirect your attention for some people, okay? This is why when we are teaching a class, and there is some sort of distraction like in the hallway or something goes on, it can take me a good 4 to 5 minutes to get my class back sometimes, right? And freshmen is very sensitive to that. I notice freshmen, you really that's why they're not leather. I'm really good with like the 16, 17 freshmen. They make me a little scared. Because they are more distracted, more easily distracted. So as you go through that cycle, it gets harder, but then the other thing is every distraction. So imagine 237 phone notifications, and if it takes you, let's say, even just 2 minutes to redirect your attention, that's a lot of time wasted. And when they say it took me an hour to do my biology homework, how much of that is because they're doing that, right? They're directing. Plan breaks is another important thing. So if you are studying with focused, solid, committed attention, our mental effort, cognitive load, 30 to 45 minutes, okay? That's what most people can handle, a focused, undivided attention. After that, you need a little bit of a mental break. You need to recharge your batteries. So plan breaks. Get a timer, not your phone. Old-fashioned egg timer works great. Get a timer. Everybody's a little different. Some people, 20 minutes is about their max. We all have a little bit different capacity. But then have like a 10 to 15 minute break. Now use the timer. And the reason is that if you have a timer and you're working and you're starting to feel tired and you just glance, you notice you have 5 minutes left in your timer, you go, well, I can do anything for 5 minutes, okay? You can keep going. If you just decide, I'm going to stop when I feel tired, you actually stop way sooner than you really need to. This is why when I do my speed work for my running coach, I have everything on my watch. Because if I just relied on myself to figure out my pieces of my run or whatever, trust me, it would not be what it's supposed to be. And then when you do take a break, it should be, I always recommend nothing electronic. Outside, physical activity is great. Meditation is great. What you want to do is get your brain into something we call diffuse mode. You want that relaxation. Knitting is probably one of the best breaks. This is why Mrs. Conley has knit clubs. We have knitting club in the school. Knitting shows a huge effect size in terms of how it can help in making breaks. But essentially non-electronic, because you just don't want to go down the rabbit hole, okay? Painting, scribbling, I don't know, something like that. But 10 to 15 minutes. Everybody's a little bit different, okay? I tell my students, I do this too. I do this too. All right? All right. So here's a little group poll. So which of the following is the most important ingredient for successful learning? Okay. Guys, a second. And then I'll just by show of hands. How many of you think it's number 1? Number 2? 3? 4? 5? Thank you for not saying 3, because there is no such thing as personal learning style. The idea that I'm a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner, those are learning preferences, but they're not learning styles. If our brains could only learn in certain ways, we'd sort of be in trouble. Your boss is not, you're not going to tell your boss, like, when you get to Google or Apple or whatever, you know, I didn't really understand your presentation, could you act that out? Not, right? It doesn't exist. Learning styles doesn't exist. If you mention learning style and if somebody who does educational psychology, you will get, trust me, they'll take you to the mat. It's bad. It's funny. All right, it's what you think about when you're studying. That is actually the biggest key, because it goes back to deliberate practice. All right, so pop quiz. I'm not going to ask you to answer these. Just think about them in your head. So how many of you would be able to answer who wrote the Harry Potter book series? How about whether Taylor Swift is married? Yeah. And does the hat go on the left or the right of the sink? How many of you would be able to do that? Did you want to learn any of that stuff? There was no intention to learn that Taylor Swift is not married, right? We don't. Right? We don't do that stuff. Just wanting to learn is not a key ingredient for learning. Okay? The reason I remember something like that is because it had some emotional or cognitive salience to us, or it was just needed for something else, like, right? And the hot is one of those things you have to think about, right, a little bit, because it's become so automatic in hearing. All right, so if just simple intention helps us learn, and just paying deep attention and just like simple repetition really helped us learn. This would never be, nice to meet you, Steve. I intend to remember his name, Steve, 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 and then the next time, I'm like, hi, Bill. Okay, right? We've all had that. I'm terrible with names. And the only way I can remember people's names is I have to do an association with them. I have to think about something about them to do that. And simple repetition doesn't help you learn. Seeing something just simply over and over and over again doesn't really necessarily help you. Okay. So, which one is the real penny? I can't even answer this. But this is a very famous cognitive psychology demonstration. I'm hoping somebody knows. I was figuring Linda would know.
I know, I would guess the last, the furthest to the right on the top row, but I have no idea.
It's the one that says 1 cent, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it the one that says
I
one?
think so.
I don't think that was anything on. Right, and so just simple repetition is help us learn. Intention to remember things doesn't always necessarily help us.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know either. I always mean to check every time and then I just never do. I don't think you can't, I don't even think, yeah.
I remember last four digits of my credit card.
Yeah, wow.
It does not say that way. Oh, it doesn't, okay.
And Liberty is on the side,
Oh, wait.
and 1 cent is on the other side. So I think it is the top left.
The top left?
Oh,
Not
sorry,
the top, it's the top right, isn't it?
No.
Top left?
Where's the year?
Is there United States of America?
Does it say US,
Trust?
United States at the top?
No, it is.
in God.
And God Trust.
Oh, it is, this, it's the furthest to the right.
This one right here?
That's, no, because the dates is long.
Okay. Who knows?
It's only got
Well, anyway.
Australia.
This is like
Point made.
every single
There we go, the
learning
bottom.
workshop I go to shows you this slide. I don't know.
It's
where I just get it out of the book.
None of them. None of them. None of the above.
All right, so if you don't remember what you intend to remember, what do you remember? You remember what you think about. So memory is the residue of thought. Okay, so we're gonna use a little scratch paper now. There's a little scratch paper. Don't write these down yet, but I'm gonna give you guys a pen right now, just to have it.
These are writing utensils.
Yeah, don't write them down now.
I hope these pens
Because that'd
work.
be cheating. We're gonna test your thing. So, well, we actually have enough people here, this will actually work. If I do this sometimes, if you only have 2 people, it really doesn't work very well. Alright,
Only one more. One more than the.
Okay.
so we're gonna make this easy. So I'm just gonna make everybody on this side of the room group 1. And you guys are gonna be group 4, because why not? So, you got this side and this side. You have these words. You guys are just going to, not writing anything down, but you gotta just memorize these word lists. You gotta figure out and memorize these. You are gonna look at each word and decide whether it makes you feel happy, sad, or indifferent as you go through the list. Okay? So I'm gonna do about 30 seconds here on my watch. And then, yeah, all right. So go ahead and go. I'll give you guys about 30 seconds as we go through the list. All right, so now I want you to write down all the words you can remember. And again, I'll just give you about 30 seconds. All right. So I'm going to have you guys check your words against the actual list and see. Now, hopefully this. We have a little skewed distribution size, but it was just a lot easier to try to do that. Alright. So there's 14 words on the list. Alright. How are you over here? Did you get about 5?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We'll do like a
Wow, good.
Knowledge sharp.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ooh, okay. 11. Wow, okay. So you got, all right, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, all right. So we got to what, 10, 11 over here? We got a couple of people.
Yeah, several
Yeah,
times.
several 10s over there. We had the 1, 11 over here. So it works better when you have huge, bigger sample. But when you think about things, you tend to have something more to remember than just trying to actually memorize, right? So trying to, you're associating pleasure, whether you have an association with that word. So thinking about your thinking actually can help you remember a little bit more. So,
Can I just say, it's interesting, because I thought of the words that I didn't like, and that made me feel, just like average, and I wrote all those ones down, but all the words I really liked,
well, that's
I
interesting.
only had like 3.
What does that tell us about you?
But it's like, obviously
Negative
negative
bias is
things
Mhm.
must affect, because I was like,
Well,
there's only 2 words that I really don't
we-
feel
we
good about.
do
Yes,
know
I
that.
wrote them down.
Negative things, if you get like one negative comment, like one,
Yeah.
somebody gives you one criticism, it takes you like 4 more positives to like counteract
Wipe
that.
it out.
And you always remember it.
Yeah, you always remember.
You always
it.
remember,
It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Is that why you remember the really lame, nasty teachers?
Yes, I
Yeah.
Or the horrible kid who
that's
used
why
to.
everybody remembers that. Wow.
Gonna crack down on the,
Yeah. So what we understand is that effective learning depends on your storage strength, which essentially is the encoding step. So encoding the information in a way that optimizes meaningful associations and minimizing confusion. We remember we encode. So we want to think about is how do I get it into the system in the first place? In that encoding step, how am I getting it into the system? That's what we want to talk about. We also need to talk about retrieval strength. That is the deliberate practice or the active practice of optimizing the likelihood the information will be recalled and applied accurately. You have to retrieve, remember. Okay? So these are sort of the things we need to depend upon when we're trying to build our memory. Okay? So improving our storage and retrieval strength. So storage strength. So this is our encoding side. Okay? So elaboration, making meaningful associations with things that we're trying to remember as it's within our working memory here. Distinctiveness, focus on key distinctions. This is one of the reasons why compare and contrast. Teachers love like compare and contrast, looking at differences. Chunking, putting coherent information together, like you remember chunks and numbers better than you do. Think about those. Personalization, making a personal connection. With the words you were trying to associate something good or bad. Overlearning, which means just going beyond basic mastery, like taking those next steps. This is why like Kuma math helps a lot because people are just feeling sometimes just need a little bit of extra time with the active practice, about 10, 15 minutes a day. Working through examples. So working through an example and then slightly changing a slightly different example, just a little bit different. So when we do the encoding in a classroom, one of the things that is a motto of mine is do one, see one, explain one. So what I try to do with my classes is always give at least 3 exposures to some material. When they see one, they do one, they explain one. So see one is essentially maybe like my lecture, my introduction, or they're working with an activity or a figure or a model. Do one is some sort of lab activity, group activity. Explain is where the kids are sort of jigsawing to reinforce information to each other and explain it. What you're trying to do is something called dual encoding. Dual encoding is where you bring things in from a couple of different perspectives, essentially. So So your encoding strength improves. So your resolution of that scan, of that photograph into your computer, we need to increase that resolution. That's what we're doing when we repetitively encode that information. We're improving that resolution. So retrieval strength is retrieval practice or self-testing, distributed practice and interleaving. Okay? So retrieval practice or self-testing, it's an active recall and trying to do the re-encoding back into the system again. Distributed practice is spacing it out, which is why cramming doesn't necessarily work and things like that. And interleaving means integrating different concepts from within or topics from the course you're in and studying them in together rather than just isolated. I'm on chapter 2, so I'm only going to say chapter 2. Well, let me go back to chapter 1 a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on just some of this retrieval strength stuff in here. So what we know doesn't lead to effective learning. Simple repetition, highlighting. My daughter was annotating her English. She was annotating something from Emerson. She was explaining to me she has a system for her highlighting for her annotations that works because she's ascribing meaning. Her highlighting system, I don't know because I tell you I'm not. But she has a different color, whether it's an actual quote that she could use in writing a paper, an essay, whether there's something thematic, or, and I think the other one is if it's like symbolism. But she has these codes for highlights because her highlights are actually meaning something. There's a girl in her class, who does not understand annotation, and what she does is she's like, I just like the rainbow. So she just goes with all these different colors, and she doesn't understand the method. So that's sometimes what kids are doing, rather than you can use highlighting successfully if it's because you're ascribing meaning to a system, like a color coding system.
I know in the 7th grade, Mrs. Marks makes them highlight their book based on different symbols, so if it, or themes.
Right.
So that's good, but then when you see the kid who just he's coloring.
But then what you're doing with that is you're going back and reorganizing that information into some type of schema. I have a lot of kids who just highlight coloring, and I'm like, what is up with your book? And or they only highlight the words that are already in bold. Those bolded, it's kind of funny. Memorization of isolated facts. So they just memorize something like hypertonic, hypotonic in biology, and they don't really go through what is the actual underlying meaning of the word. They just memorize the word in there. Reading only the chapter summaries, we get that a lot. Spark notes. Studying with friends or distractions, rereading your notes. What happens is this just shallow processing, and it builds to false confidence. We call this the illusion of familiarity. Right? So you're just doing that. So I'm going to talk about retrieval practice, or self-testing distributed practice first. So distributed practice, if it's done right, is an active retrieval, which means you're actually going back through the material, like I'm going to now reorganize my lecture notes that I took in class into my own schema. And for each kid, it's a little different. Kids who are very artsy, I often encourage them to represent things in pictures and figures and drawing. They're learning about the brain and the structures of the brain. Draw a brain, ascribe different colors to the different sections, things like that. So, that's where you can sort of integrate your learning preferences in those types of things. I've had kids, I make cartoons, make a cartoon of what is happening in osmosis in this situation. Make cartoon panels. Right? So what you're trying to do with an active retrieval is recall the information and somehow reorganize that so that it integrates into your schema, because you're trying to recombine it with things you already know. What you need to do is distribute that practice with spacing. Okay? So the forgetting curve. So Ebbinghaus is this guy, this is like 125 years ago, it was like 1880 or whatever. He basically sat in a room and memorized random word syllables, and he would just space out his practice. And he noticed that if he spaced this with so many days or time in between, he would reinforce, he'd remember these random things better. So we still talk about the Ebbinghaus curve. But so your recall is better if you space it. This is why I tell my students you have to plan. You have to say, what's my monthly, my weekly plan? And this is why in the upper school we really try hard to have our teachers say, this is what you're doing for a whole week. My students get an entire unit's worth of stuff at one time, so they know the schedule for the whole unit, so they know when quizzes and tests and things So I give them like a unit ahead, and you know, things can sometimes change, snowstorms, or you're having really trouble on a topic, but it's always gonna be in their favor, not against their favor. But you have to plan ahead, and most students, if you ask them what are you studying next, it's whatever's most due. You plan ahead, that's pretty much no 1%, right? It's not. So you have to do this space practice. So with every time you space it, your forgetting is less. And what you're essentially doing is you're just strengthening this memory schema. You have to do that. So you have to distribute the practice. Just clumping them all together really doesn't work. You really have to kind of distribute it. All right, and then interleaving. This is another. It's easier to explain this in terms of math, but interleaving is where you revisit material from past units during distributed practice. So while you're practicing, you go back and look at a little bit of material from a different chapter. So like with math, this works really well. If you're doing some problem sets, incorporate a couple of problems from a previous unit or chapter. This works really great in chemistry with like Greg's class. Because what you're doing is you have different types of problems and you start interleaving some of those into what you're studying for that night or reviewing for that night. It helps you to see the connections. It helps with transfer.
Latin too. Languages.
Yeah, languages, yeah. So I always tell my students to take time to reincorporate, what we're doing into what we just learned in previously. I try to encourage my students to have what we call learning log. It's how we get a journal. And essentially at the end of the day, do a brain dump. What are all the different things that we talked about? Can you remember what we talked about that day in lecture? And then can you reorganize those into some sort of concept map? And then as you go through the semester, you can add to that concept map because you're going back and learning that. This is also about this is more on the teacher side of it, the teachers organizing their material so that when kids get practice problems, the practice problems arch back to prior topics. That's a very important thing to do, especially as you're going through a semester. Because when you get to a semester exam, we're expecting that you can do this type of transfer. So if as a teacher you're not doing it throughout the semester, that's not going to do it any favors, yeah. All right, so the last thing we're just going to talk about a little bit is metacognition, the student's awareness of their level of understanding of the topic. So metacognition is essentially knowing what you know and what you don't know. And as humans, we're not that great at it. But metacognition is one of those things that distinguishes you as a stronger and weaker student. You can develop metacognition. You have to be taught how to do it. I mean, you kind of do. I think it's something you don't really realize about. Even like, I didn't really understand what metacognition was until I started going to all these institutes. I was like, oh, that's what they call it. Actually understanding what you don't know. But having that awareness, and I think there's a maturity level that comes into it, and as well, but also trying to do that. But just being aware of it is kind of important. Okay, so I'm gonna toilet study. Right, so in 2007, there were these psychology people talked to these Yale students, and they give them an interview. They basically asked them to rank whether they could explain or not explain how some object worked. So they had like a pencil on there, and they had like a wrench, and they had a toilet. Can you explain how a toilet works? Okay. A lot of these kids, from Yale, said, yeah, I can explain how a toilet works. Okay, so in your own head, you think you can explain how a toilet works. Now, I'm sure there's an engineer in the audience, and I don't know if you really have, like, right? But you could explain. So, this is what you think you know, okay? Like, you think you know how a toilet works, because you use one every day. So you might think, oh yeah, I can talk about the inner chamber and the trapway and all that good stuff, but that's what you actually know, okay? Like, that's what you know, all right? And so when you are asked to explain it, you suddenly realize what you don't know. That's metacognition. So we call this the illusion of familiarity, all right? So being familiar is knowing that you've seen a stimulus before, but having a little other information about it, okay? Recollection is richer association to the target. What you really want is recollection. So feeling you know something is not reliable. So this is why rereading your notes or just rereading over your book is a terrible way to study. Unless you're rereading your book because you have a specific objective in mind, like I'm rereading my book to understand how chapter 2 connects to chapter 3. And understanding how to read a book is a whole nother lecture
You could do that, okay.
and how to actually read. Reading to learn rather than learning to read. Better is to judge whether you know it by self-testing after 30 minutes. Okay, this is how most kids study. The Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. 1776. Okay. No. 30 minutes. That's just, I just kind of made that up, but like 30 minutes. Okay, give yourself some time and then self-test. Use the questions at the end of your chapter. Knowing means being able to explain, not understanding when someone else explains it or you read. Okay, so a lot of times students are like, but I understood what you talked about lecture. I understand, but can you explain it? That is the key. So if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. This is why I spend a lot of time with my students in group work where they're trying to explain to each other a phenomenon. They have to explain it. And I try purposely to pair up students who I've recognized as sort of different, kind of like different processing speed, I guess would be the way. Because I want them to explain it to somebody else and to help with that. So, yeah. Alright, so the illusion of familiarity. So I get this a ton from students, like I understand what you meant, but then when I actually sit down with them and we diagnose a test, they're like, oh, well, I didn't know which one was right. Oh wait, I didn't know how. They can't put into words an explanation for it, but they say it was very familiar to them. So that is one of the biggest things I often see with students is just that idea of I've seen it before, I can figure it out. Given enough time, I'll be able to just pull it out of my recess of my brain and figure it out. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm never going to tell you how a toilet actually works. It's just never heard it. All right, so these are the resources that I use if you want to see them again. So Barbara Oakley, she actually also has a course, was it called a MOOC? Yeah, she has one on learning how to learn. She apparently is like the biggest MOOC out there, like so many people have taken it, and she goes through all these principles, and after she did that course, she wrote this book, and she actually also has a companion workbook that goes if you want to take her course. But this is a really good book for like middle school kids, I really recommend that one. And then Outsmart Your Brain by Daniel Willingham. I really sort of like this one for high school, college level kids.
Is the middle school one like for middle school teachers or for
Middle
the
school
actual
kids,
child?
child. She wrote that one so that it would be able to be incorporated for kids who are in middle school. Yeah, it was funny because I bought Learning How to Learn first, not realizing, and I was looking at this going, wow, it took me like, I just flipped through really fast. And she was like, oh, well that's because the Mind for Numbers is the higher level book. It says a Mind for Numbers because it's a little bit of her own history of how she went from being a student who failed every math class, who barely passed school, to becoming a distinguished engineer. Anyway. But his book, Daniel Willingham, I really like because it's a little bit more prescriptive. It has like a chapter on how to read a textbook, a chapter on how to talk to your teacher when you have a chapter on like how to analyze a test if you failed. Like there's 12 chapters and each one has sort of a prescription for it. So he also wrote a book called Why Kids Don't Like School, which is very phenomenal.
I think I have that.
So I was trying to go for 9:30 or 9:20. I'm a little over. Sorry, there's a lot of stuff in there.
That was good content.
I hope that